Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm tackling the impossible to answer question, what's the best version of Dungeons and Dragons, or which is the best edition of Dungeons and Dragons? Now, others have attempted to answer this question, and I've noticed a trend. The most common answer you're going to get from a lot of the grognards, and I'm using that term as a derogatory, is whichever edition they played when they were 8 years old. To them, that's the only edition that exists, and they will bend over backwards and tie logic in knots to try to convince you that's the only edition worth playing. To the grognards, stick this middle finger up your butt, and if you get pleasure out of it, I don't know what to tell you. Um, and if you don't, I'm good with that. Because to claim the best edition is the version you grew up with is fucking, it's a fallacy. So get over yourselves. Now, I have the fortunate experience of having played multiple editions as a kid. And I never played an official, like, strict by the rules version of Dungeons and Dragons. We just sort of cobbled together, me and my friend group, Dungeons and Dragons campaigns using some basic D&D materials, some AD&D materials, and some second edition materials because that's what was available to us at the time. And so the easy answer is the best edition of Dungeons and Dragons is whichever version you play. That's the easy answer. But you're not here for that. You want me to give a definitive statement. So, fortunately for you, I spent the last year reading every core rulebook from every edition of Dungeons and Dragons, including OD&D and Chainmail, as well as BECME and the Rules Encyclopedia, and all of the OSR clone equivalents. So I'm well versed in the various rule sets. So I believe I can give a fairly objective analysis based on the fact that I don't have emotional ties to any one particular edition over another. Now, the first core rulebook I ever owned was second edition Player's Handbook, but I paired that with first edition AD&D Monster Manual. So I didn't even follow a strict guideline even as a kid. But needless to say, I have played campaigns in most editions. I've never played a fourth edition campaign, so my knowledge of fourth edition is tedious or tedious at best, tenuous at best. Sorry, not great. I don't have firsthand experience with fourth edition. I read the rule books. I've seen some let's plays, if you will, online, and I've talked to other people who have played it. So I have an idea of how fourth edition works. But again, the rules are guidelines. So basically do what works for you. But let's put that aside for a second. Let's just kind of go through the different editions as they exist. Chainmail isn't even Dungeons and Dragons at all. It's miniature warfare. And it expands into Dungeons and Dragons, but the problem with the original D&D is it's not a complete game. It assumes that you have access to chainmail as well as other games that are mentioned in the booklet. And so it makes a lot of assumptions. And it's not a complete game. And for that reason alone, and for the fact that a lot of the rules are very vague and there's just not a lot of guidelines, I can say with a fair degree of certainty that original Dungeons and Dragons, while fine for the time, it really wasn't. And the reason why I say that is because even after they initially published it, they immediately went straight to expanding it and clarifying it in Dungeon and later Dragon magazines, as well as incorporating new and expanded and reinterpreted rules in the expanded pamphlets that kept coming out. So even the creators of Dungeons and Dragons recognized this game was flawed and it needed to be fixed. The first reimagining, if you will, or reinterpretation of Dungeons and Dragons came in the mid 70s, just 2 or 3 years after the original D&D was published. This was sort of a more concise collection of the existing rules as they had been spread out through multiple pamphlets. And this is known as the first version of basic Dungeons and Dragons, which it wasn't called basic D&D yet. It was just called Dungeons and Dragons. So some um, people lump this in with original D&D because it basically is the original D&D rules just collected in a single book and, you know, interpreted or rephrased in a more concise manner. Now, this is still a fairly incomplete game. It still requires a lot of interpretation by the dungeon master and the players themselves. So there's going to be a lot of arguments if you're playing this version of the game as the rules are written, which is why I do not recommend OD&D or this version of basic D&D, because there's just too much room for interpretation, which leads to arguments because players are going to insist the rules don't forbid it, and then Dungeon Master is going to insist, I'm God, you do what I say. And I have had games like this. I have experienced this version firsthand. It's not fun. As an oddity, as a curiosity of, hey, how did people play D&D in 1975? It's interesting to explore, but as a legit way to sit down and play the game properly, it's not fun. There's no fun. Because, again, it assumes, most likely rightfully so, that you are coming into Dungeons & Dragons with an existing background in miniature warfare, which was probably a safe assumption in 1974, but not a safe assumption by 1976, because the game blew up that fast. Which means this game makes a lot of assumptions about its players that are going to likely be false, especially if you're playing it today. You probably didn't even know Dungeons & Dragons started as a miniature war game. So you're probably like, what the fuck? The next version of Dungeons & Dragons is a split version. It's actually two editions. It's the 1981 Basic Edition, which is known as BX, and the 1978-79 Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which came out in 3 core rulebooks and then was later expanded. BX exists as 2 core rulebooks, Basic and Expert, and a bunch of modules. There's not a lot of expanded rulebooks. There's a couple of monster compendiums under BX, but it was quickly, very quickly, replaced with BECMI, which is short for Basic, Expert, Companion, Master, Immortal, which was the definitive, thorough, continuation of what BX started. And the reason why BX was abandoned is because, again, BX was an incomplete game. In the Basic and Expert rulebooks, it makes reference to a companion rulebook that never happened because, for whatever reason, TSR decided to abandon BX and replace it with BECMI. Now, before we get into BECMI, because oh boy, do I have thoughts on that, let's talk about Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Now, the brief history behind the existence of AD&D is very simple. Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax co-created Dungeons & Dragons. Dave Arneson left TSR, the company that produced Dungeons & Dragons, and Gary Gygax and TSR Inc. did not want to pay Arneson royalties, so they created a, quote, new game, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, in a legal effort to not pay Arneson royalties. Arneson sued, they settled out of court, and he basically got royalties. But in a condition of the lawsuit, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons could go forward only as long as a basic edition existed so that Arneson could get his royalties. That was the condition they made. Which is why BX led to BECMI, which led to the Rule Cyclopedia in 1991. Now, eventually, TSR would fold. Wizards of the Coast would buy the remnants of TSR, and then Hasbro would flat out buy Wizards of the Coast, And in 2000, when they merged the two editions into just Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition, they paid off Arneson to make him go away. He eventually died, as did Gary Gygax. But let's sidestep. Let's talk about advanced Dungeons and Dragons for a second. I will argue that advanced Dungeons and Dragons is a thorough, complete edition of Dungeons and Dragons. If you buy those 3 core rule books, you can play Dungeons and Dragons, and you can more or less play a game that looks and feels very similar to what you're used to today if you played modern editions, 3rd edition, 4th edition, Pathfinder, 5th edition, whatever. So, advanced Dungeons and Dragons feels like Dungeons and Dragons to me. However, it is also written in the obnoxious Gary prose, Gygax prose, which means it's got a lot of room for interpretation. And Gygax puts a lot of unnecessary and arbitrary limitations on character races and classes and things you can do in the game, which does make advanced Dungeons and Dragons by today's standards feel very antiquated. If you're going to play advanced Dungeons and Dragons, my recommendation is do so cautiously. Go into it knowing that there are going to be limitations that are probably going to hinder your enjoyment of the game. For example, if you want to start out as a first level half-elf bard, you cannot. The bard class does not exist as a class in Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The bard class is actually a multi-class feature of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where you start out as one class, multi-class into another class, and then multi-class into a bard. It's obnoxious. It's um it's silly. It makes no sense, especially the base classes that lead up to the bard. It's like, what? So that's one example of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons being arbitrarily complex. Now, all of the editions up to 3rd edition, all of them, OD&D, Basic, BX, BECMI, AD&D, 2nd edition, they're all plagued, and I use the word plagued, with a very convoluted combat system known as THAC0, which stands for 2-hit armor class 0, which again is convoluted because 0 is strong armor class, 1 is weak armor class, 10 is basically no armor. It's confusing because not only do you have to reverse logic, which means you have to use subtraction, which is fucking bullshit, but also you have to calculate, you have to do a lot of math. You basically have to know what number your character needs to roll to hit a 0. You have to compare that to what number you rolled. You have to compare that to the actual armor class of the target, and then you got to do some math. It's unnecessarily complicated, and I'm sorry if you are arrogant and you believe you're better than people because you can use THAC0. Fuck off. Fuck you. THAC0 is unnecessarily complex. If you got it figured out, good for you, but do not be smug about it. All right? Not everybody can do math. Which meant you cannot play 1st edition or any of these previous editions without the reference books because you have to have the charts. It's the only way to play the game because you have to be able to look at the chart to figure out what number you have to roll to hit, which is very unnecessarily complex. In the D20 system, you don't even need the chart. Armor class is 13. I rolled a 13. I hit. It's simple. It's, elegant. It's perfect. It makes sense. THAC0 does not make sense. Now, if you understand the origins of Dungeons and Dragons, THAC0 from a mechanic does make sense because it's based on naval warfare games, and in Navy games, a 0 class is the best armor, and then a 1 rank is less rank, and it just goes up. I don't understand why, but that's the way it worked in naval war games. So that's where THAC0 comes from. Again, this is TSR assuming you already have a base understanding of previous games that they didn't have anything to do with, which is a false assumption to make, especially by the time we get to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition in 1989. We are a decade removed from its wargaming origins. So you have a whole host of people, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, who've never even heard of miniature war games, let alone played them. So this was a thing that rightfully the creators of Dungeons and Dragons corrected with 3rd edition on. Some of the OSR clones that try to emulate the retro rules as best as possible do provide an optional ascending armor class rule, which is what we're used to, as well as the descending armor class rule, the THAC0 rule, for those who want to try THAC0. But those who don't do have the option of ignoring it. Now, if you want to save yourself some trouble, just take whatever the THAC0 number is. Just take the armor class number and subtract it from 20, and that's your base armor class. That's the easiest method. It's 9 times out of 10 going to give you the same number. 9 times out of 10. So instead of doing the formula and figuring out that this creature has an armor class of 7, I have to roll a 13 or better, you can just say 7 away from 20 is 13. Okay, I need a 13 or better. You can just reverse the armor class. You don't have to look at the charts and do the THAC0. Now, this is a breaking of the rules because your THAC0 numbers get better as you level up, which means it's easier. You have an easier time hitting. You just apply that as a bonus. Just apply that as a bonus to your 2 hit. Now, as far as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons goes, it's got the races and classes you're used to. It's got the monsters you're used to, and the structure you're used to. Like I said, with just some arbitrary rules that kind of get in the way. If you don't mind the limitations, this is a fun version to play. Now let's sidestep again. BX. BX is a very somewhat simplified version of the game, but also complex version of the game. Unnecessarily complex, because in trying to simplify, they over-explain some of the rules, which makes it just even more complex than it needed to be. As bad as that is in BX, it gets 10 times worse in BECMI. Unless you were born in 1972 and your first edition of your first exposure to Dungeons and Dragons was BX or BECMI, I do not recommend either edition of those versions of those rule sets, and that includes the Rule Cyclopedia from 91. It's not worth playing. You have even more arbitrary and unnecessary limitations because you don't have race and class. You have race as class. So you don't play an elf who can be a fighter or a paladin or whatever. You're elf. That's your class. Elf is class. And you have features of elf. And that's convoluted and stupid. I do not like races class. It's stupid. Because it assumes all elves are the same. All dwarves are the same. There's no room for variety. It's very xenophobic, very racist. It's very bullshit. It's very othering, and I don't like it. Now, 2nd edition AD&D is more or less Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, just streamlined And what I mean by that is there were a lot of optional publications in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that expanded the rules. Second edition AD&D basically just compiles all those optional rules into one rule book. It just streamlines everything. It does do away with the unnecessary complicated evolution into a bard, and it lets you just start out as a bard if you want. And it also separates the different classes into as subclasses of a primary class. It categorizes everything as warrior, um, priest, wizard, or rogue. Rogue is not class. Thief is a rogue class. It's confusing by today's standards. If you can get past THAC0, either figure it out or use the cheat that I just taught you a few minutes ago, second edition is a worthwhile version to play. Um, it's gonna have the feel of AD&D, but it's a little more streamlined. Some of the rules have been clarified, some of the rules have been expanded, so it does more or less play very similar to what you're familiar with. So it is an adequate version of Dungeons and Dragons to play if you want to explore an older edition of Dungeons and Dragons. It has limitations, and it has some quirks that I'm not a fan of. Namely, all clerics and paladins, etc., are priests. I don't like that because it assumes they have religion. It also lumps the druids in with the priests, and I don't like that either as a pagan. Um, so again, it's kind of like it's taking a very Christian slant to the game. Now, the other thing I don't like about second edition, which I didn't talk about with first edition, is AD&D first edition introduced the concept of deities and demons and devils. So it had a lot of occult references in it. But it came out around the time as the Satanic Panic. So TSR scrubbed all of that from second edition. BECMI doesn't have any of it. There's no gods in BECMI. They're referred to as immortals. And BECMI even has a whole rule set, a whole book on how a player character can become an immortal, which is, as far as I know, is the only edition of official Dungeons and Dragons material that actually has a path for a player character to become a god. Only they're not going to be referred to as gods. They're gods for all intents and purposes. Well, more accurately, demigods. But um, m- making a player character as a god or a demigod is as simple as the DM saying, sure, go for it, and then letting you do it. So you don't really need rules for that. At the end of the day, it's all going to come down to what you and your DM agree to allow in the game, what works for the game. So if the DM says no, God has said no. If the DM says yes, God has said yes. The dungeon master is God in Dungeons and Dragons. You can't argue with God. You can, but you're not going to get your way. You're going to get expelled from the game. So don't argue with the dungeon master. It's, at the end of the day, it's their game. So if you don't like it, go find another game or DM your own. Now, third edition gets a lot of praise, but the problem with third edition is it was needlessly streamlined quickly as a way to make Dungeons and Dragons more accessible to the masses, but it had um the side effect of being needlessly complicated because in giving players more options, they just made it even more convoluted. They attempted to rectify some of this when they revised it with the 3.5 edition, but this introduced the concept of min-maxing and customizing your characters or building a character um, to spec to maximize your, you know, your skills and your feats and your bonuses and rolls and everything else, which made it feel more like a board game than a role playing game, or even a video game. Some would contend. There are countless books published under third edition and 3.5 that expand the player options to infinity. You can customize to your heart's extent. If that's what you want, third edition or 3.5 edition is the edition for you. Or you can get a streamlined rule set in Pathfinder, which is basically the same thing. Um, Pathfinder is more or less the OSR retro clone of third edition, even though it came out shortly after third edition. It's weird. Fourth edition we don't talk about, but I'm just going to tell you why we don't talk about it. Fourth edition introduced powers. It introduced the short rest, but it made it like oh, you can get all your powers back after a short rest. It basically took away all the danger. It's like your characters can just, get in a fight, get beat up, catch your breath and get all your powers back. No. That's too much like a video game. Now, 5th edition kept some of that, unfortunately. Oh, that is one of the common complaints. But it also, did away with the powers. And I didn't like 4th edition because you don't have spells as a spellcaster. You have powers. And your powers are you produce spell-like effects or spell-like abilities. I don't like that because it did away with the whole concept of magic in Dungeons and Dragons and replaced it with superpowers, which I do not like. And it gave superpowers to fighters and bards and rangers and thieves and everybody else, and it's like, no, thank you, I don't like it. 5th edition has been the longest running edition of Dungeons and Dragons. It hasn't been replaced. It's had a longer shelf life than any other previous edition. And the scuttlebutt, if you will, coming out of TSR, or excuse me, Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro, is the new revision is not going to be a completely new edition, just an expansion of 5th edition. I will argue till I'm blue in the face that 5th edition is the definitive version of Dungeons & Dragons. It literally has something for everybody. It can be streamlined to the point where you can just pick up and play in a matter of minutes, or it can be customized to your heart's extent, just like previous editions. It has open-ended rules, but it has wiggle room for hard rules if the dungeon master so decides. It's, to me, I'm not going to say the perfect edition of Dungeons & Dragons because I don't think that exists. It's as close to perfect as you're going to get created by human hands. And I will argue until I'm blue in the face that 5th edition is the definitive edition of Dungeons & Dragons. I have played all of them except 4th edition. I've never played 4th edition. I won't go so far as to say I never will, but there's like an 85% chance I likely won't. So take that with what you will. I just have no interest in powers. It just doesn't interest me. It's like, no, that's just too different for me. It doesn't feel like D&D. I don't like it. And if you have to modify the game to do away with the powers, you're basically just making it 5th edition anyways. Why not just play 5th edition? So there's really no point for 4th edition to exist as far as I'm concerned. I do own the books, but only because I'm a collector and I want all the books. Not all the books. God damn. I don't live in the Vatican. I don't have that much space in my library. But I want all the core rule books. Meaning Player's Handbook from every edition, or equivalent, Dungeon Master's Guide or equivalent, and Monster Manual or equivalent from every edition. The exception being 2nd edition. I do not want any of the monster compendiums because I'm just going to, for if I play 2nd edition ever, I'm just going to use the AD&D 1st edition monster manual. It's basically the same goddamn thing. It's close enough. It's close enough that it works. You know, purists will say it breaks the game, but it's just more of the fun. However, I will argue that third edition or 3.5 edition is a perfectly solid version of the game, and AD&D first edition and or second edition is a perfectly solid version of the game. None of the basic editions are worth a shit. That includes BECMI, that includes Rule Cyclopedia, OD&D, Chainmail. Chainmail is a whole different beast. BX, etc. Those are not worth your time. Don't even bother. And I will argue that fourth edition isn't worth your time, so don't even bother. That's my definitive answer, as close as I'm going to get. But at the end of the day, play how you want to play as long as the group and the dungeon master agrees. Stay cool.